Pro wrestling and drama go hand in hand like milk and cookies. It's hard to look back at any period of time in the business without seeing some form of drama or controversy muddling it all up. There's so much controversy in this business that it's gotten to the point that it's really not that controversial anymore. If you ask a random wrestling fan to name a controversial wrestling moment, I'm sure just about all of them would think of something. And chances are, the first moment that would pop up in their very large wrinkled brains would be the Montreal Screwjob. Normally this would be the part when I start giving context, but we all know what happened. I know, you know, your dog knows, everybody knows. Every single piece of wrestling media has talked about it at some degree, and I don't think I need to add to the pile.
First part is the fact that Bret had creative control in his contract when it came to dealing with his name in the company, and as such, Vince McMahon.
All I'm doing is asking the question, what if it didn't happen? What if the Montreal Screwjob never happened? I could see two ways that it doesn't happen. Are they realistic? Of course not. Egos are too huge in the wrestling business. Not to mention the money.
Hello, I like money.
But like I said before, I'm not focused on realism. So let's go over the two scenarios and what would happen. One way that the Screwjob doesn't happen is if Vince just doesn't go through with it. Whether he just doesn't think of the plan, or Bret gets wind of the plan and they call it off, I'll leave up to your imagination. Match goes as planned, ends in a big schmoz, and Bret leaves Montreal still the champ. What happens next? Bret would have either handed over the belt or dropped it to someone the next night on Raw, at least according to what was said by Bret and those close to him. I highly doubt he would have dropped the belt to Shawn cause, you know, they weren't exactly the best of friends at the time. He most likely would have dropped it to Undertaker or Austin since they were both some of the biggest stars in the WWF at the time. There's even a rumor I found online that Bret tried to talk Vince into letting him drop the belt to Ken Shamrock. Seeing him with the belt would have been really cool to see, but I doubt he would have held it that long with all those other big names there at the time. Best case scenario, he holds it until the Royal Rumble in '98. Kane would be a good option for someone to take the belt at the time. He was their top monster, and he could have used that in his feud with The Undertaker, I guess. But would I have given the belt to Kane? No, I don't think so. The feud didn't really need that belt, honestly. Vader is my personal favorite for the guy to take the belt. He was supposed to win the title the year before until Michaels had his little hissy fit and prevented that from happening. I'm sure Bret would have been more than willing to drop the title to Vader and make him look like a beast on the way out. Plus, he should have won the WWF title at least once during his career, and it's a crime that he didn't. Fuck you, Shawn. I guess Owen Hart could be another option, but after what happened between him and Austin at SummerSlam that year, I doubt he'd be touching the main event scene anytime soon, especially with Bret gone. Even if he did somehow get the title, just like Shamrock, he wouldn't have held the belt for long. Another person heavily affected by what happened that night was Vince McMahon. More precisely, the Mr. McMahon character. The Screwjob was a huge reason for the character existing. If the Montreal Screwjob didn't happen, there's a chance the Mr. McMahon character wouldn't exist, or at least not the same one from our timeline. The catalyst for the character to exist could still happen. That Mike Tyson Stone Cold segment could have kickstarted it. Some DX shenanigans could have as well.
Oh no! DX in the second control of the truck.
That's a penis.
But nothing would have been as impactful as the Montreal Screwjob. And without the Mr. McMahon character, you wouldn't get the Austin McMahon rivalry, which was a huge part in bringing Austin into the forefront of the WWF and making him their main guy. It would be harder for Stone Cold to become the main guy for the WWF without the Mr. McMahon character to feud with. I'm sure his Mania 14 build and audience reactions would be very similar to our timeline, but what would happen after? He would definitely still be a main event player, don't get me wrong. I just don't think he would be so widely known to casual fans in this alternate timeline. Not only did the Austin McMahon rivalry jumpstart Stone Cold's career, it also jumpstarted the Attitude Era as a whole. I'm not saying the Austin McMahon rivalry started the Attitude Era completely, but it helped feed into it. In this alternate scenario, without that rivalry, I don't see the WWF hitting the same heights as it did in our timeline. They would still do good business, very good business, just not as great. Business was already pretty red hot for the WWF in the 90s. I'm sure they would survive even with a little bit of money missing from their accounts. To all the people already angrily typing in the comments, I'm not saying Austin wouldn't be a main event star with multiple world titles under his name. I'm not saying the Attitude Era doesn't happen. That's stupid. Of course it still happens. All I'm saying is the WWF just makes a little less money than it did in our timeline, and that maybe Austin isn't as widely known to the average person in this alternate timeline. Bret not being screwed in Canada wouldn't put them out of business. Speaking of Bret, he would still go to WCW no matter what happened in Montreal that night. Bischoff had given him a huge money offer that Vince just couldn't match. Whether the Screwjob happened or not wouldn't have changed that. The biggest thing that would likely change with this is WCW's future. In our timeline, the WWF was booming, baby. Business was very good, and they made a good bit of money during the Attitude Era. But in this alternate timeline, without the controversy of the Montreal Screwjob to make the Mr. McMahon character and his rivalry with Stone Cold, they probably wouldn't have as much money in 2001 as they did in our timeline, which means there's a chance that they could have not bought WCW. I'm sure Vince would still make some offer, but if they didn't have the money, there's a chance someone else could have outbid them. Someone like Fusion Media, the company Eric Bischoff started to buy WCW in the first place before they were denied and Vince swooped in. Now, to all those WCW diehards still out there that just won't die, things would still go very bad for WCW. They would still be getting bought out by somebody. The Montreal Screwjob not happening doesn't fix everything for the big boys. It doesn't fix their constant overspending, their terrible backstage politics, their confusing booking decisions, and it sure as hell doesn't fix everything in the year 2000.
What does that mean? Now what?
And WCW getting bought out by someone else doesn't mean they are saved forever. Whether it be Bischoff's Fusion Media or some other TV or media company, chances are they probably won't be doing much better. Best case scenario, they're still around but are a shell of a company that they used to be. Or, the worst case scenario happens and they still just go under after a while. This is all based on the premise that WWF doesn't have the money at the time and someone else outbids them. They very well could still buy out WCW in this alternate timeline. They could possibly even get it for even less money than in our timeline. In regards to Bret Hart's WCW career, I don't think much changes. Probably would be less fanfare for his arrival into the company compared to when the Screwjob happened. Hell, maybe they won't do a stupid Screwjob finish at the end of Starrcade 97 and Sting actually wins the title clean, but that's just me being hopeful. Bret allegedly signed a 3-year contract with WCW in 1997, so unless he's able to get out of it early, he'd be there until late 2000. Sorry you gotta endure all that, Bret. I don't see much changing with his WCW career in this alternate timeline. I just hope that match with Goldberg at Starrcade 99 doesn't happen, or it at least goes different. But either way, I don't see Bret sticking around WCW once his contract ends. Since Bret left WWF on much more amicable terms, he could very much go back to them once his WCW contract ends. I would see him going back to the WWF despite whether if the Goldberg Superkick still happens or not. If it does, I could see him going back in an on-screen manager role or a producer role or something. If it doesn't happen, Bret could go back to the WWF in late 2000 or early 2001 as a wrestler. Imagine Bret coming back to WWF in 2001 as an active wrestler. Bret Hart having matches during this time with guys like Kurt Angle, The Rock, and Triple H is something I think about a lot. But one match that I would love to see is Bret Hart versus a younger Brock Lesnar in 2002. I just want to see what that match looks like. Hell, Bret could wrestle into the late 2000s or early 2010s. It could happen. Let me dream. So now we've talked about the first scenario on how the Montreal Screwjob didn't happen and the effects of that. But there's still another way that it could have not happened.
Where do you think you're going?
As hard as it would be to believe, technically there is a way that Bret could stay in the WWF. And that is if Vince honors the contract he offered him and actually has the funds to pay the amount he said he would. If he did this, he could lock Bret into a 20-year contract. Which means Bret would be in the WWF until 2017, which is pretty wild to think about. Anyway, Vince doesn't break the contract and Bret is here to stay. What now? It's pretty safe to say that the creative side of the WWF would be pretty different going into 1998. Bret would almost definitely hold the title into the new year. I think he would hold the belt until Mania 14 to drop it to Stone Cold to give him his big moment and give him his win back from Mania 13. Personally, that would make the most sense, and you could tell a pretty damn good story with that. After Mania 14, I think Bret would still be a pretty active player in the main event scene going into the 2000s. Once we get into the early to mid 2000s, Bret would probably take more of a legend / special attraction role like Michaels and Undertaker did in our timeline. He could even become a sort of coach for up-and-coming stars like Brock Lesnar, Batista, Randy Orton, John Cena, CM Punk, and so on. In regards to Austin and McMahon, pretty much the same as the first scenario I discussed. Montreal Screwjob doesn't happen, which doesn't give Vince the catalyst to become the Mr. McMahon character and feud with Austin. Like I said earlier, they could probably make up some scenario to get it to happen, but it wouldn't be as impactful as Montreal was. I could go further into the scenario of Bret staying in WWF, but I don't want this to turn into a fantasy booking video. Business would still be very good for the Fed. Good enough for them to have enough money to buy WCW in 2001? Who knows? Speaking of WCW, despite how bad things got for them, believe it or not, it could still get worse with WCW.
Okay, we're trapped. Everyone for himself. Okay, let's go. Let's go. Get out of my way.
Bret coming to WCW was a huge deal for them. Like, holy crap, WCW is getting one of WWF's biggest stars of the 90s. With or without the Screwjob, Bret jumping ship would still turn a bunch of heads. Not enough heads to save WCW, but that's beside the point. Bret not going to WCW at all would just hurt them more in the long run. Especially if we still get a screwy finish to Sting vs Hogan at Starrcade 97. Granted, not sure how worse it could get for them during this time, but it very well could. I'm sure some ticket sales, pay-per-view buy rates, and TV ratings were because of Bret being on the card. Even with how badly they booked him during most of his run there. Without him in this alternate timeline, WCW would lose out on the money he would have brought in, which definitely wouldn't make things better for them.
Spaghetti-O, we got a real serious problem.
Would this result in WCW going under sooner than it did in our timeline? No. They were still owned by Ted Turner until AOL Time Warner came in and gave them the boot in 2001. I doubt that timeline would change that much, if at all. WCW would just be in an even worse position than they were in our timeline. Whether WWF is still the one to buy WCW, who knows? They could still be down a little money without the Screwjob happening, but with Bret still around, I think they might make up for it. WCW would just have to hope and pray that WWF isn't the one buying them out in this alternate timeline. The Montreal Screwjob not happening would cause some pretty significant ripple effects into the wrestling industry. There would be several other things that I haven't discussed that would be affected by it not happening. So let's list off some of the bigger effects that I couldn't fit anywhere else in the video if the Montreal Screwjob never happened. At the 1998 Royal Rumble, Shawn defended the WWF title against The Undertaker in a casket match. During the match, HBK landed on the edge of the casket, causing him to herniate 2 discs in his lower back and completely crush another one. With what happened in Montreal not happening, Shawn likely wouldn't be going into 1998 as the champ, which means that casket match with The Undertaker wouldn't happen and he wouldn't screw up his back so badly that it nearly ends his in-ring career. So what would happen? Whether Bret leaves the WWF or stays, in my opinion, Shawn would most likely not get another title shot until after WrestleMania 14. He'd probably just hang out with his buddies in DX and do some funny shit. I'm sure he'd win the world title a few more times over the next few years in this alternate timeline, and I'm sure he would still act like an insufferable prima donna to everybody during this time too. Fuck you, Shawn. So in our timeline, Rick Rude was furious over what happened with the Montreal Screwjob. He was even allegedly in the room when Bret confronted Vince McMahon afterwards. Rick would then later call Eric Bischoff to tell him what had happened and that it was definitely a real shoot, brother. Since Rick was only working for the WWF on a per appearance agreement, he and Eric would then negotiate a deal for Rick to jump ship to WCW. In this alternate timeline, Rick would stay in the WWF, no matter if Bret stays or goes. Rick would probably just stay in DX and be their bodyguard or whatever he was. In 1999, he was training for an in-ring return before he died. Maybe he could return to the ring at some point. Who knows? Two other people that definitely would have stayed are Jim Neidhart and Davey Boy Smith. Chances are they would have just stayed with Bret Hart and the Hart Foundation. Things could have went differently in Davey's life to prevent his death, but with the troubles and demons that man's had in his life, it's hard to say. Either way, the members of the Hart Foundation would have stayed in the Fed. Speaking of the Harts, so yeah, this topic is a little grim, but I think the Owen Hart tragedy could have possibly not happened in this alternate timeline. That is, if Bret stayed in the WWF. If he would have stayed, I doubt Bret would have even let Owen do that blue blazer gimmick in the first place during the Attitude Era. Bret would have most likely kept the Hart Foundation going in some form for a long while if he stayed, and I'm sure Owen would have been involved in that. If Owen did somehow end up doing the gimmick, I'm sure Bret would have prevented Owen from doing the stunt that night. Bret's gone on to state multiple times that if he was there, he would have talked Owen out of doing that stunt. Now, if Bret went to WCW, it's tough to say. I guess it would depend on who pitched that idea in 1999. Trust me, I dug around for a while, but I could not find who pitched the idea to do the blue blazer gimmick during that time. But in my opinion, unfortunately, I think the tragedy would still happen if Bret went to WCW. Owen was his own guy, and he would give any idea pitched to him his 110%. And I feel like if Bret left, this idea would still be pitched for Owen to do. And that tragedy, sadly, probably would have still happened. Man, that was a pretty depressing one to end on. Let me see if I can find one more. Oh, here's one. Admittedly, this one's pretty shaky, but if WWF doesn't do as well business-wise in its alternate timeline, Vince might not have the capital to start up the XFL. To all of you XFL fans out there, I apologize. I'm sorry you won't get to see Vince try to compete in an industry he was a total newbie in. I'm sure both of you are heartbroken. What happened in Montreal changed everything, for better and for worse. The effects of that night can be felt in the business to this day. And you damn sure won't forget about it either with the ungodly amount of wrestling media that just won't shut up about it. Now this is most likely the most controversial topic I've discussed so far. I know a lot of you will discuss this in a nice and friendly manner in the comments, but I expected this. Anyone that talks about the Montreal Screwjob is going to have people all stirred up every time no matter what they say. That's why so many wrestling media outlets love talking about it. Which is why I wanted to have a different discussion about this topic. I wanted to ask the question, what if it didn't happen? Now, like I said in all my other videos, this is just my opinion on what could happen. If you have a different opinion on what could happen, that's fine. I'm sure tons of people out there have different opinions from me. I want to thank you all for watching this video and sticking it out to the end. Make sure you leave a like, share this with your friends, and subscribe to Kayfabe Alternate History so you don't miss future videos. I'm currently in the process of moving into a new house, so don't expect another video for probably at least a couple of weeks. Before I go away for a bit, I just have one last note to end on. Fuck you, Sean.